Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The hum of the luxury sedan purred softly as Valerie Chambers navigated the quiet suburban streets of her neighborhood. It was a serene evening, the kind of calm that masked the chaos simmering just beneath the surface of society. Valerie, a highly respected judge, had spent another long day deliberating on a complex, high-profile case. Her mind, ever sharp, replayed the day's proceedings as she contemplated the nuances of justice and fairness. The glow of streetlights streaked across her windshield as she thought about her daughter's upcoming graduation. The excitement of the milestone was tinged with guilt. She'd been so consumed by work that she hadn't even started writing her speech. It was a promise she made to herself every year: take a break soon. Relax. Recharge. Yet, every year, the demands of her career consumed her resolve. Lost in thought, Valerie was startled by the abrupt flicker of blue and red lights in her rearview mirror. Her heart sank. She wasn't speeding, hadn't run a stop sign, and her vehicle was in perfect condition. Confused, she pulled over to the side of the road and turned off the engine. The quiet of the street now felt heavy, the flashing lights casting an ominous glow around her. Reaching for her purse, she pulled out her driver's license and registration. She rolled down her window as the sound of approaching footsteps punctuated the stillness. Two officers emerged from the shadows, their uniforms crisp but their demeanor anything but professional. "License and registration," barked the taller of the two officers, his tone sharp and impatient. His name tag read Reynolds, and his piercing gaze betrayed a sense of superiority. "Of course, officer," Valerie responded calmly, handing over her documents. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" The shorter officer, stocky and bald, whose badge identified him as Daniels, smirked. He leaned closer, his flashlight scanning the interior of her car with unnecessary scrutiny. "We'll ask the questions," he muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. Valerie's instincts as a seasoned judge told her to remain calm and compliant. She had seen cases where situations like this escalated far too quickly. "Understood," she replied, her voice steady but firm. As Reynolds scrutinized her documents, his partner stood uncomfortably close, the beam of his flashlight now directed at Valerie's face. She blinked against the brightness, maintaining her composure. Questions followed, their tone accusatory rather than inquisitive. "What's a woman like you driving a car like this at this hour?" Daniel sneered, gesturing toward her high-end sedan. The insinuation was clear: she didn't belong in a vehicle of this caliber, not at this hour, not in their eyes. Valerie exhaled, keeping her tone neutral. "I'm returning home from work." "Work, huh? And what kind of work is that?" Reynolds asked, his voice laced with sarcasm. "I'm a judge," she stated plainly, knowing the response would likely be met with skepticism. The officers exchanged a glance, and Daniels let out a mocking laugh. "A judge? That's a good one," he said, shaking his head. Reynolds stepped back, flipping through her documents with deliberate slowness. It was clear they weren't interested in her explanation. Their intention wasn't to investigate but to intimidate. Valerie could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken power dynamic they sought to enforce. "Step out of the car," Reynolds commanded abruptly. Her heart skipped a beat. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" she asked, her voice firm yet polite. "Do you have something to hide?" Daniels interjected, his hand resting casually on the holster of his firearm. Valerie knew she had no reason to refuse, but the request felt arbitrary and unwarranted. "No, I have nothing to hide," she replied, unbuckling her seatbelt. She stepped out of the car, her head held high, her confidence unwavering. As the officers continued their so-called investigation, Valerie's mind raced. She thought about her daughter, about the community she had dedicated her career to serving, and about the systemic issues she had spent years trying to address from the bench. Tonight, she wasn't a judge or a community leader, she was just another target. The encounter stretched on, with the officers subjecting her to a series of baseless accusations. They ignored her credentials, dismissing her as a liar. Valerie remained composed, knowing that her silence and cooperation were her best defenses for the moment. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Reynolds handed back her documents. "You're free to go," he said curtly, the disdain in his voice still palpable. Valerie returned to her car, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the steering wheel. As she drove away, her mind churned. This wasn't just a random traffic stop. It was a reminder of the prejudice and power imbalance that plagued society. But what the officers didn't know was that this story was far from over. They had no idea who she was, or the authority she wielded. This was only the beginning. Valerie Chambers drove home in silence, the adrenaline from the encounter slowly wearing off, leaving behind a mix of frustration and determination. The officer's smugness had ignited something within her, a resolve to ensure that such abuse of power wouldn't go unchecked. Valerie wasn't one to let her emotions dictate her actions, but tonight felt different. Her mind replayed every detail of the encounter, cataloging the officers' words, their demeanor, and their baseless actions. She had spent her career fighting for justice, but this time, the fight had landed squarely on her doorstep. The next morning, Valerie rose early. The sunlight filtering through her bedroom blinds did little to chase away the lingering unease. She brewed her usual cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen counter, and pulled out her laptop. As she sipped her drink, she began drafting a detailed account of the incident, including the time, location, and the officers' names. Years of legal experience had taught her the importance of documentation. If this was going to go anywhere, she needed a clear, unbiased record of what had transpired. She paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. This wasn't just about her, it was about everyone who had been subjected to similar treatment but lacked the means to fight back. Valerie had spent her career ensuring the scales of justice remained balanced, but now, she couldn't ignore the weight of systemic bias pressing down on one side. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was her daughter, Simone, who had come home from college for the weekend. Simone's presence was a welcome distraction, and for a while, they talked about graduation, the upcoming ceremony, and Simone's plans for the future. But even as they laughed and reminisced, the memory of the previous night lingered in Valerie's mind. Later that day, Valerie received a call from the court clerk about a scheduling update for her cases. As she reviewed the docket, one name caught her eye: Officers Reynolds and Daniels. They were involved in an excessive force case that had just been assigned to her courtroom. Valerie's stomach tightened. It was as if fate had delivered this case into her hands. For a moment, she hesitated. Would her personal experience with these officers compromise her objectivity? She considered recusing herself, but quickly dismissed the idea. If anything, her encounter gave her deeper insight into their behavior. She resolved to approach the case with the same fairness and integrity she brought to every decision. The day of the hearing arrived, and the courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation. Valerie entered, her robe flowing behind her as she ascended to the bench. She scanned the room, her gaze briefly settling on Reynolds and Daniels. They didn't recognize her at first. To them, she was just another person they had harassed on the street. But as the proceedings began and Valerie introduced herself, their faces paled. "Your Honor," began the attorney representing the plaintiffs, "this case involves allegations of excessive force and misconduct by Officers Reynolds and Daniels. The plaintiffs, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, were pulled over without cause, subjected to verbal abuse, and physically harmed." As the attorney laid out the evidence, Valerie's mind raced. The Thompson story mirrored her own experience, but their ordeal had been far worse. Video footage from a nearby security camera was presented, showing the officers manhandling the couple and using unnecessary force. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the footage played, each frame a damning testament to the officers' behavior. Reynolds and Daniels squirmed in their seats, their earlier bravado replaced by visible discomfort. Valerie maintained her composure, her expression neutral as she listened to both sides. The defense attorney argued that the officers had acted within protocol, but the evidence told a different story. During a recess, Valerie retreated to her chambers. She closed the door and leaned against her desk, taking a deep breath. The weight of the case pressed heavily on her, but she reminded herself of her duty. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. She had to set aside her personal experience and focus on the facts. The trial continued, with witnesses testifying to the officer's pattern of behavior. Several individuals came forward, recounting similar encounters with Reynolds and Daniels. Each story painted a picture of officers who abused their authority, targeting vulnerable individuals under the guise of law enforcement. By the time closing arguments were made, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Valerie retired to her chambers to deliberate. She reviewed the evidence, the testimonies, and the legal precedents. Her decision couldn't be swayed by emotion or personal bias, it had to be rooted in the law. The following day, she returned to the bench to deliver her verdict. The courtroom was silent as she addressed the parties involved. After careful consideration of the evidence and testimonies presented, it is clear that the actions of Officers Reynolds and Daniels violated the rights of the plaintiffs. Their behavior was not only unprofessional, but also unlawful. She continued, outlining the legal ramifications of their actions and the consequences they would face. As she spoke, she noticed Reynolds and Daniels exchanging nervous glances. They had come into her courtroom confident in their untouchable status, but now, they were confronted with the reality of accountability. When the session concluded, Valerie removed her robe and exited the courtroom. Outside, she was approached by the Thompsons, who thanked her with tears in their eyes. "You've given us hope," Mrs. Thompson said. Valerie nodded, humbled by their gratitude but acutely aware that the fight for justice was far from over. As she drove home that evening, Valerie reflected on the events of the past few weeks. The encounter with Reynolds and Daniels had shaken her, but it had also reinforced her commitment to her work. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, systemic change never was, but she was determined to continue using her position to make a difference. That night, as she sat in her study, Valerie began drafting a speech for Simone's graduation. It wasn't just about celebrating academic achievements, it was about inspiring the next generation to stand up for what was right, to challenge injustice, and to never back down in the face of adversity. For Valerie, the personal had always been political, and her journey was a testament to the power of perseverance and integrity. She smiled as she typed the final words of her speech, her resolve stronger than ever. The story of Officers Reynolds and Daniels would serve as a reminder that no one was above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it. And for Valerie, it was just one chapter in a much larger fight for justice. Valerie's days returned to their usual routine in the weeks following the conclusion of the case involving Officers Reynolds and Daniels. Yet, the encounter had left an indelible mark on her, altering the lens through which she viewed her work and her role in the justice system. She had long understood the power dynamics that permeated society, but living through the experience had deepened her resolve to push for meaningful change. However, life had its own way of reminding her that change was often met with resistance. One morning, as she sat in her chambers reviewing case files, her assistant knocked lightly on the door. "Judge Chambers, there's someone here to see you." They said it's urgent. Valerie glanced at the clock. She had a packed schedule, but the tone of her assistant's voice made her pause. "Send them in," she said, setting her pen down. The door opened to reveal a young man, barely in his 20s, with wide, fearful eyes. He clutched a manila envelope to his chest as if it were a lifeline. "Your Honor, I didn't know where else to go," he stammered, his voice trembling. "Take a seat," Valerie said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "What's your name?" "Marcus Taylor," he replied, sitting down nervously. "I'm sorry to bother you like this, but I need help. I heard about how you handled the case with those two officers, and I think something similar is happening to me." Valerie's interest piqued. "Tell me what's going on, Marcus." He took a deep breath, then began to explain. Marcus worked as a delivery driver in a predominantly affluent neighborhood. A week ago, he had been pulled over by two officers for what they claimed was a broken taillight. He knew his car was in perfect condition, but he complied. The situation quickly escalated. They searched his car without cause, detained him for hours, and issued a citation for reckless driving, an offense he hadn't committed. When he tried to file a complaint, he was stonewalled at every turn. "They threatened me, Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice breaking. "They said if I didn't stop asking questions, they'd make sure I lost my job. I don't know what to do. I can't afford a lawyer." Valerie's chest tightened. The details sounded eerily familiar. "Do you remember the names of the officers?" she asked gently. Marcus nodded and slid the envelope across the desk. "I wrote everything down. I even got a copy of the citation and recorded part of the stop on my phone before they made me turn it off." Valerie opened the envelope and scanned the documents inside. Her stomach churned as she saw the names, Reynolds and Daniels. It appeared they hadn't learned a thing from their courtroom defeat. If anything, they seemed emboldened, using their positions to continue their pattern of intimidation. "Marcus, I'm going to help you," she said firmly. "But I need you to be prepared. This won't be easy. These things take time, and the system doesn't always move as quickly as we'd like." Tears welled in his eyes. "Thank you, Judge Chambers. I just don't want them to get away with it again." After Marcus left, Valerie sat in silence, the envelope still in her hands. She knew this case would be more complicated than the last. The officers were likely embittered by their prior defeat, and taking them on again would mean exposing herself to further scrutiny and backlash. But she couldn't turn a blind eye, not when she had the power to make a difference. She began by contacting the Internal Affairs Division, providing them with the documentation Marcus had given her. She also reached out to a trusted colleague, a civil rights attorney named Angela Hayes, to discuss the possibility of filing a civil suit. Angela was known for her tenacity and shared Valerie's commitment to justice. "Valerie, you realize this could put a target on your back, right?" Angela said during their initial phone call. "These guys don't seem like the type to back down quietly." "I know," Valerie replied. "But if we don't stand up to them, they'll keep doing this to people like Marcus. We have to set a precedent." Angela agreed to take the case, and together they began building a strategy. Marcus's phone recording provided damning evidence of the officers' misconduct, and they were able to track down other victims who were willing to come forward. The more they dug, the more they uncovered a disturbing pattern of abuse spanning years. It wasn't just Reynolds and Daniels, it was a culture within the precinct that enabled such behavior. As the case gained traction, media outlets picked up the story. Valerie found herself thrust into the spotlight, her name appearing in headlines alongside the officers she was fighting to hold accountable. She received both praise and criticism, with some lauding her courage and others accusing her of overstepping her role as a judge. The increased attention brought its challenges. Valerie began receiving anonymous threats, some subtle, others more explicit. Her home was vandalized one night, a spray-painted message on her garage door reading, "Stay in your lane." It was a chilling reminder of the risks she was taking, but it only strengthened her resolve. Simone, ever the voice of reason, confronted her one evening. "Mom, are you sure this is worth it? I'm scared for you." Valerie placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "I'm scared too, Simone. But if we let fear stop us, nothing will ever change. What kind of example would I be setting if I walked away now?" Simone nodded, her eyes filled with both worry and admiration. "Just promise me you'll be careful." As the case moved forward, Valerie and Angela faced numerous roadblocks. The precinct's leadership was uncooperative, and key documents conveniently went missing. But they pressed on, uncovering enough evidence to build a solid case. By the time the trial began, the courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and concerned citizens. Marcus testified with a quiet strength that moved everyone in the room. He recounted his experience with raw honesty, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. Other victims followed, each story adding to the damning portrait of Reynolds and Daniels. The defense tried to discredit the witnesses, but the evidence was overwhelming. When the jury returned with a verdict, the tension in the room was palpable. Valerie sat in the gallery beside Marcus, her heart pounding. The foreperson stood and announced the decision, the officers were found guilty of misconduct and abuse of power. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers and tears. Outside, Valerie addressed the gathered crowd of reporters. "This case is not just about holding two officers accountable," she said. "It's about dismantling a system that allows such behavior to thrive. Justice isn't a destination, it's a journey. And we still have a long way to go." As the crowd dispersed, Marcus approached her, his eyes shining with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "You don't have to," Valerie replied. "Just promise me you'll keep fighting for what's right, no matter how hard it gets." That night, as she sat in her study, Valerie reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The fight wasn't over, but she had taken a significant step forward. For the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope, not just for herself, but for everyone who believed in the possibility of a fairer, more just world. The weeks following the trial were a whirlwind for Valerie. The verdict had sent ripples through the community, sparking intense debates about accountability, systemic reform, and the role of law enforcement. While the case was a significant victory, it also served as a reminder of the challenges that lay ahead. Valerie had expected backlash, but the intensity and scope of the response were overwhelming. The threats against her escalated. Anonymous emails flooded her inbox, filled with vitriol and warnings to back off. Some were vague and unnerving, others were explicit enough to make her question her safety. The vandalism at her home became more frequent, with broken windows and slashed tires serving as stark reminders of the dangers she faced. Despite increased security measures, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Her colleagues were divided. Some judges and attorneys applauded her courage, privately expressing their admiration. Others, however, accused her of stepping outside her role, claiming that her involvement in the case had compromised her neutrality. At a professional luncheon, a senior judge confronted her. "You've made yourself a target, Valerie," he said, his tone a mix of concern and reproach. "This isn't how the judiciary operates. We're supposed to interpret the law, not crusade against it." Valerie met his gaze steadily. "If interpreting the law means ignoring injustice, then maybe it's time we rethink what our role truly is." The room fell silent, her words hanging in the air, like a challenge. Valerie knew she had alienated some of her peers, but she wasn't about to apologize for standing up for what she believed in. One evening, as she reviewed upcoming cases in her study, Simone walked in, carrying 2 mugs of tea. "You need to take a break," she said, setting one mug down beside her mother. Valerie smiled tiredly. "I'll rest when I know we've made some real progress." Simone frowned. "Mom, you're burning the candle at both ends. This fight, it's not just about them. It's about you, too. You can't help anyone if you're not taking care of yourself." Valerie sighed, knowing her daughter was right. She reached out and squeezed Simone's hand. "You're wise beyond your years, you know that?" "I get it from you," Simone said with a small smile. The conversation lingered in Valerie's mind as she prepared for bed that night. She knew she needed to find balance, but the weight of her responsibilities made it difficult to step back. Every day brought new stories of people like Marcus, individuals who had suffered under the same broken system. Valerie felt a deep sense of obligation to continue the fight, but the strain was undeniable. The following morning, she received a call from Angela. "We've got another problem," Angela said without preamble. "I just got word that Reynolds and Daniels are appealing the verdict. They're claiming procedural misconduct." Valerie felt a jolt of frustration. "On what grounds?" "They're arguing that the media attention influenced the jury," Angela explained. "It's a flimsy argument, but it's enough to get a hearing." Valerie rubbed her temples. She had anticipated this move, but hoped it wouldn't come so soon. "What's our next step?" "We fight it," Angela said firmly. "But I wanted to give you a heads up. This is going to get even messier." Valerie thanked her and hung up, her mind already racing. The appeal would undoubtedly draw more attention, reigniting the controversy surrounding the case. She braced herself for the storm that was sure to follow. True to Angela's prediction, the appeal made headlines. News outlets dissected every aspect of the trial, from the evidence presented to Valerie's involvement. Pundits debated whether her actions had crossed a line, while social media buzzed with both support and condemnation. Valerie tried to tune out the noise, focusing instead on preparing for the hearing. As the appeal date approached, Valerie found herself reflecting on her journey. She thought about the young woman she had been when she first entered law school, idealistic, determined, and unshakably optimistic. Back then, she believed that the law was a pure and impartial force, capable of righting society's wrongs. Decades of experience had tempered that optimism, but it hadn't extinguished her belief in the power of justice. The hearing took place in a packed courtroom, with reporters and spectators filling every available seat. The officers' attorneys argued that the trial had been compromised by media coverage and public opinion, painting Reynolds and Daniels as victims of a biased system. Angela countered with a compelling defense, highlighting the overwhelming evidence of their misconduct and the procedural safeguards that had ensured a fair trial. Valerie watched the proceedings from the gallery, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She knew the outcome was out of her control, but the stakes felt personal. If the appeal was granted, it would send a chilling message to others who sought accountability. It would also embolden those who believed they were above the law. After hours of arguments, the appellate judges adjourned to deliberate. The room buzzed with anticipation, everyone anxious for a decision. Valerie remained in her seat, her gaze fixed on the empty bench. When the judges returned, the tension in the room was palpable. The presiding judge announced the decision: the appeal was denied. The original verdict would stand. A wave of relief washed over Valerie as applause broke out in the courtroom. She exchanged a triumphant glance with Angela, who gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. Justice had prevailed, but Valerie knew the victory was bittersweet. The system had worked this time, but it had taken immense effort and personal sacrifice to achieve that outcome. In the days that followed, Valerie began to reassess her approach. She realized that while individual cases were important, they were only part of the solution. Systemic change required a broader strategy, one that addressed the root causes of injustice rather than just its symptoms. She began collaborating with advocacy groups, lending her expertise to initiatives aimed at reforming policing practices and increasing oversight. She also started mentoring young lawyers and judges, sharing her experiences and encouraging them to approach their roles with integrity and empathy. One evening, as she sat in her study drafting a proposal for a community-based accountability program, Simone joined her. "You're still working?" Simone asked with a teasing smile. Valerie looked up and laughed. "I'm trying to make the world a better place." "It's a full-time job." Simone sat down beside her. "You already have, Mom. More than you know." Valerie's heart swelled with pride. She reached over and hugged her daughter, grateful for her unwavering support. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but she knew she wasn't walking it alone. As she returned to her work, Valerie felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight for justice was far from over, but she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. This was her calling, her duty, and her legacy. And she wouldn't stop until the scales of justice were balanced for everyone. The following months marked a turning point in Valerie's life. Her commitment to justice and systemic reform became more than a mission, it was a movement. What had started as a personal encounter with misconduct had evolved into a platform for change, drawing attention from activists, legal scholars, and community leaders alike. Yet, as her influence grew, so did the resistance from those determined to maintain the status quo. Valerie began her mornings early, often with a cup of tea in hand as she reviewed letters from citizens sharing their own stories of injustice. Each letter carried a sense of urgency and hope, a plea for someone to finally listen. She made it her mission to respond to as many as possible, knowing the impact of simply being heard. Her evenings were filled with town hall meetings, panel discussions, and brainstorming sessions with advocacy groups. One night, after a particularly engaging community forum, Valerie returned home to find a thick envelope waiting for her on the dining table. Simone had picked up the mail and left it there, along with a note, "Thought you'd want to see this ASAP." Intrigued, Valerie opened the envelope and found a collection of documents, photographs, and a handwritten letter. The letter was from a retired police officer named William Hayes, who had worked in the same precinct as Reynolds and Daniels. In painstaking detail, he recounted years of systemic corruption, ranging from falsified reports to violent cover-ups. He admitted to staying silent during his tenure, fearful of retaliation, but he could no longer carry the burden of his complicity. The documents included internal memos, disciplinary records that had been buried, and photos of bruised and battered victims. Valerie's hands trembled as she read the letter. This wasn't just about two rogue officers, it was about an entire system that had protected them. The implications were staggering. If she pursued this, it could lead to a full-scale investigation, but it would also place her squarely in the crosshairs of powerful adversaries. She spent the next day consulting with Angela and a trusted investigator. Together, they pieced together a timeline of events and identified key individuals who had enabled the misconduct. The scope of the corruption was wider than Valerie had imagined, involving not just officers but supervisors, union representatives, and even local politicians. The more they uncovered, the more determined Valerie became to see it through. The decision to go public with the evidence wasn't an easy one. Valerie knew the risks, professional, personal, and physical. But the alternative, turning a blind eye, was unthinkable. She organized a press conference, inviting journalists and community leaders to hear what she had uncovered. The conference room was packed when Valerie stepped up to the podium. Cameras clicked, microphones buzzed, and the air was thick with anticipation. She began by recounting the initial incident that had brought her to this point, then laid out the evidence of systemic corruption. She spoke with clarity and conviction, her words a call to action for both the public and the authorities. "Justice is not just about punishing individuals," she said, her voice steady. "It's about dismantling the systems that allow injustice to thrive. We cannot settle for accountability in isolated cases. We must demand transparency, oversight, and reform at every level." The fallout was immediate. The precinct became the center of a firestorm, with calls for resignations, external investigations, and federal oversight. Protests erupted across the city, with citizens demanding change. Valerie found herself both celebrated and vilified, depending on who you asked. For every message of support, there was a threat or a smear campaign aimed at discrediting her. One evening, as she left the courthouse, Valerie noticed a figure lingering near her car. She tensed but kept walking, her keys clutched tightly in her hand. As she approached, the figure stepped into the light. It was William Hayes. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I just wanted to thank you." Valerie relaxed slightly, though her guard remained up. "You're the one who took the real risk, William." Coming forward took courage. He shook his head. "It was long overdue. I've spent too many nights haunted by what I didn't do. You gave me a chance to make it right." They talked briefly before parting ways, but the encounter stayed with Valerie. It was a reminder that change wasn't just about exposing wrongdoing, it was about giving people the opportunity to choose a better path. As the investigations unfolded, the depth of the corruption became clearer. Arrests were made, and several high-ranking officials were implicated. Valerie's name remained at the center of the narrative, a symbol of resilience and accountability. Yet, the victories were tempered by the realization that the fight was far from over. One particularly grueling day, Valerie returned home to find Simone waiting for her in the kitchen. She had prepared dinner, a rare treat given her busy schedule. "You're spoiling me," Valerie teased, setting down her bag. "You deserve it," Simone said with a grin. "But seriously, Mom, how are you holding up?" Valerie sat down, the weight of the day catching up to her. "I'm tired, Simone. But I'm also hopeful. For every challenge, there's been a moment of progress. It's slow, but it's there." Simone nodded. "I know I don't say it enough, but I'm proud of you. You're making a difference." Valerie felt a lump in her throat. "Thank you, sweetheart. That means everything to me." As they ate, Valerie realized that while the journey had been arduous, it had also been transformative. She had seen the best and worst of humanity, but she had also witnessed the power of perseverance and community. The fight for justice was never easy, but it was always worth it. Over the next year, Valerie continued her work, balancing her duties as a judge with her commitment to systemic reform. She spearheaded initiatives to improve transparency in law enforcement, mentored young professionals entering the legal field, and remained an unwavering advocate for those who had been silenced. Her legacy grew, not as a woman who sought the spotlight but as one who refused to back down in the face of adversity. She had proven that even in the darkest corners of society, there was room for light. And for Valerie Chambers, that light was enough to keep her moving forward, one step at a time.